All right, hi everyone. So in this chapter, we are going to go over the skeleton and talk about some of the different bones that make up the skeleton and how they fit together. So this video is going to be a little different than kind of what we normally do because a lot of this material is information that you kind of need to just go and study independently. And so I'm going to go through and explain a few kind of important concepts and point out some things that have been confusing for students in the past, and we can look at some pictures, but it's really something that you have to just study and practice, right? All these bones, what their names are, where they're located, how they fit together, that kind of stuff just takes practice, okay? And so with this chapter for your exam, I am not going to be putting any pictures of any bones or the skeleton or anything like that on the exam. So all of your exam questions for this chapter are going to be word-based. And so I want to refer you to your chapter review, all right, for this chapter, because I give you lots of example questions of the types of things that I can ask. And so they have a lot to do with, how bones fit together. Is this bone part of the axial or appendicular skeleton? Things like that, okay? And so use that chapter review, right, as part of your studying. And then on your homework, I do have questions on the homework with pictures, and some labeling and stuff like that, and then some examples of, and probably some of them even taken straight from your review, right, on your chapter homework, just to help you prepare, okay, and help you study the bones and learn about them. But again, on your exam, there will be no pictures of bones, okay? All right, so let's get started by first talking about the difference between the axial and the appendicular skeleton, okay? And so in this picture, they're kind of color-coded, all right? And so the axial skeleton is going to be here, everything in kind of this teal color, okay? And so it includes the skull, all right? It includes the vertebral column and the sacrum, right, at the base of the vertebral column. It includes the ribs as well, all right? So all of that is the axial skeleton. And then the appendicular skeleton is going to be everything that's kind of that natural bone color, that tan color, all right? So these are going to be essentially your limbs. So everything that comes off of the axial skeleton is appendicular, so your arms and your legs, okay? And so it's going to be important to understand where the axial skeleton meets, or we always say articulates, right, forms a joint with the appendicular skeleton. So where axial and appendicular meet. And so we're going to look at this in more detail a little later, but where they meet, you can see, I'm going to zoom in, all right? So superiorly, they meet here, okay? So the clavicle, this collarbone here, all right, articulates with the sternum, which is part of the axial skeleton, and that's where they meet superiorly. Inferiorly, axial and appendicular meet here, all right? So this bone here is the sacrum. So the sacrum articulates with this bone here, right, your pelvic bone. It's called the os coxae, or the coxal bone, all right? And so you have one on the left side and one on the right side, okay? And so that's where it meets inferiorly, okay? All right, so the first thing we are going to do, and I'm going to try to be referring to your kind of lecture notes as we go through so I can point out anything on there that's confusing, okay? Let's see. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about shapes of bones, and then we're going to go straight into the axial skeleton and talk about different parts and components of the axial skeleton. All right, so bones all have different shapes, all right? So we can kind of categorize them based on their shape. And so Some examples of flat bones. So think of a flat bone is going to be very thin, right? The name kind of tells you they're thin and flat. These would be the bones of the skull. Most of those bones that make up kind of the cranium, well, let's say cranium, right? Because they're the thin kind of outer bones, right? So if we're looking at we have the skull here. So that would be these bones, like this bone here, the yellow one, right? They're gonna be very thin, okay? These are kind of curved. Also the sternum, the breastbone right in the middle, all right? And so you can see that here. This is the sternum right here. That is also gonna be a flat bone, okay? So flat bones are very thin and flat, all right? We have long bones. There are lots and lots and lots of long bones in the body. Okay, and so these, right, so we have long bones here, so the fibula, the tibia right next to it, your femur would be a long bone. Each of your finger bones would typically be long bones. Your humerus, all right, so your upper arm bone here, the humerus, your radius and your ulna, those are all long bones. So lots and lots of long bones in the body. All right. And so short bones, kind of by definition, are going to be bones that are as tall as they are wide, okay? And so the easiest kind of example of this would be in our carpals. We'll look at these when we get to the appendicular skeleton. So that's your wrist bones, your carpals, and your tarsals. Okay, those are all going to be short bones. All right. And then there are some bones that don't fit into these categories because they have kind of a strange shape. These would be irregular bones. So a good example of an irregular bone that we're going to see would be your vertebrae. All right. And so if you've ever seen what a vertebrae, a vertebral bone looks like, they're not short, they're not long, they're not flat. So we say that they're irregular. Okay. And then this last category, and there's two actual types of bones that fit in this category. These are kind of unusual bones, additional types of bones, all right, is what I call them in your notes. And so a sesamoid bone is a bone that grows in a tendon, right, or a ligament. And so the one example of this that you guys should know, right, and is common in everyone, is the patella. All right, so the kneecap, the patella here, all right, actually grows in the tendon of your big thigh muscles on the front. All right, so your quadriceps muscles, there's a tendon that connects your quadriceps to your tibia here. And in that tendon, that is where that patella grows. And so that's why it's called a sesamoid bone. So a sesamoid bone is a bone that develops within a tendon, okay? And then your notes also mention a wormian bone. So these are extra bones that develop in the sutures, right, of the skull. So we'll talk about with the skull. These bones are joined together, all right, by sutures. So you can actually see here, right? So there's sometimes you can get little bones that form in those sutures when that bone is ossifying. All right, so we have like a little wormian bone here and here on this picture. Okay, and so they just form in the sutures as they're ossifying. All right. So those are bones, different types of bones, kind of categorizing them based on their shape primarily, and then with these sesamoid and wormian, kind of where they're forming. Okay, so now let's talk about the skull. All right. So with the skull is very complex, right? There's lots of bones and they all fit together in very intricate ways. Sometimes it's very hard to see and to visualize on just a 2D picture like this. And like these are from your textbook, right? So like you see in your textbook and your lab manual. And so I'm going to use a little bit with the skull, this app that I have that I think is really helpful. And you guys are... I would highly recommend, all right, searching around. There are lots of free apps that do very similar things. I think Mastering A&P that you use for the lab as well also has some good features. So you can look at kind of in a 3D way look at the bones. All right, so I'll do that in a little bit because there's some bones that are really hard to see on a 2D picture like this. Okay, so but let's go through first and just talk about what the 8 cranial bones are and what the 14 facial bones are. And so on your chapter review notes, they're listed for you. All right, and so let's go through and kind of identify where each one is. So let's start with the cranial bones. All right, so with the cranial bones, we have, and this skull is nice because each bone is a different color, so we can kind of easily point them out. All right, so we have our first one here is right on the forehead, the front. This is the frontal bone. All right, so you only have one frontal bone, that's on your forehead, okay? And then on either side, right, so if we kind of look attached posteriorly to that frontal bone, we have these pink bones here, right? So you can see this is the frontal bone. And then just behind it, you have these two, there's a left and a right, pink bones. These are the parietal bones. Okay, so we have 2 parietal, and so that's what in your notes, if you see the name of a bone and in parentheses 2, that just means there's 2 of them. And so typically that's going to be a left and a right bone. Okay, so we've got 2 there. Okay, then if we keep moving posteriorly, all right, so all the way down here to the back of the skull, the base of the skull, we see the occipital bone. Whoops. All right, so we have the occipital bone here. It's kind of the base of the skull, okay? And if you look at the skull kind of from underneath, all right, you can see that it makes up, so it's not only kind of the back of the skull here, it also is almost the entire base of the skull, okay? And so there's a big hole in the middle of that occipital bone. This is where the spinal cord would leave to go down through the vertebral column, all right? So in lab, you're also gonna learn the names of a lot of these holes that you see in the skull. And so I'm going to point out now, what we call a hole in a bone is a foramen. Okay, I'll just put that kind of here. All right, so foramen is just a hole in a bone. Okay, and so foramen is singular. Foramina, whoops, let's try that again. All right, there we go. Foramina is plural. Okay, and so that's for a hole in bone. And the skull has a lot of holes in bones, and that's because the skull has those holes for blood vessels to move in and out, but also because there's lots of nerves moving in and out of the brain, a lot of them will move through those different holes. And so you can even see, just looking at the front of the skull, we have little holes here and here, here and here, there and there, right? We've got some of these, so if it's more of a line, it's called a fissure. All right, there's like a little tiny foramina there, okay? And so there's lots. You won't have to learn every single one in lab, but you'll have to learn a lot of them. All right. Okay, so that's 4 of our cranial bones. All right, so 1 frontal, 2 parietals, all right, and 1 occipital bone. And then we have our temporal bones, okay? So these are, think of like your temples, all right? So on the sides of your skull, this would be temporal. So they're orange in this picture. All right, so temporal would be these guys here. Okay, and so the temporal bones also have holes, all right, for all the nerves from your ears to enter the skull and reach the brain. So that's the temporal bone. There's 2 of those, a left and a right. All right, and so the last 2 cranial bones are internal bones. They're inside of the skull. You can see little bits of them from what we're looking at in these pictures, but the majority of the bone is located inside the skull. All right, so the first one we'll talk about is the ethmoid bone. And so the ethmoid bone, all right, sits, and I'll write it down in just a second when we have a good spot to label it. It sits kind of almost, if I were to kind of imaginary draw it, it sits right here. It sits behind the nose, but it's inside the skull. And so you can actually see little bits of it. They've got it colored in orange. You can kind of see these little pieces hanging down here. All right. You can see a little bit kind of peeking out on the sides here. You can see a little bit here of orange, all right, peeking out there. But like I said, it's internal, so you don't see the most of the bone. So if we scroll down and look at this picture here of the skull. So we've kind of taken a transverse section of the skull. And so we're looking, this picture right here, right? We're looking from the top down into the skull. And so what you'd see is right here, all right, you can see the ethmoid bone. So it's sitting, right? And so then your nose would be kind of right here in front of it. So it's sitting kind of nestled down into the skull right behind, right, where your nose is. Okay, and then the other kind of internal bone I want to point out, and I'll show you this on the app that I was talking about because it's a lot easier to see. The other bone is the sphenoid bone, okay? And so the sphenoid sits behind where the ethmoid is, all right? And it's much bigger, it's wider, okay? And so you can see it, it's in pink, all right? And so you see it on the skull, all right? It's this pink here, and you've got it on the other side as well. You can see a little bit of the pink peeking out on the sides, all right? So that's what this is here, okay? And then if you look down the inside of the skull, you can see this entire structure here. This is all sphenoid bone, okay? And you can also see it from the bottom of the skull, which we're looking at here, right? This is all sphenoid bone, okay? So let's look at the app and kind of see where this is located, all right? Okay, so this is our skull here. All right, I'm going to select first, let's do the sphenoid bone. All right, so this is our sphenoid. And so this, you can kind of see up in the top right. I don't have my laser pointer with this app, but if you look up in the top right, it shows you the name of the bone. So that's sphenoid. So the sphenoid bone, okay? And so I can kind of remove some of these bones so we can look inside at the sphenoid bone. It does not like me to remove this one particular parietal bone. Okay, there we go. All right. And so then again, that's our sphenoid bone. Okay, so highlighted. All right. And so it, to me, kind of looks like a bat. Right, so if you look at it kind of from the front, it's got like these wings coming off of the left and right. And then this, you can kind of see in the middle. I'm going to try to draw on it really quick just to show you. Let's start drawing. Okay, there we go. All right, so in the middle it has this area here, all right? It kind of looks like a little saddle. And so that is the area where the pituitary gland would sit, okay? And so this is the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone actually touches all of the other cranial bones, which is a very unique feature of the sphenoid bone, okay? So let me just clear this drawing. Yes, I do want to clear it. Okay, and so now let's look at the ethmoid bone. Okay, can we exit drawing mode? Thank you. There we go. Okay. All right, and so that's the sphenoid. And so then the ethmoid bone would be, there we go, this guy here. Come on. We don't want those, just those parts. We want to select the whole thing. There we go. All right, so that's the ethmoid bone, okay? And so remember, we said it sits kind of behind the nasal cavity, so you can see that now. All right, so if we look at it kind of like our picture, looking straight on, you can just see those little pieces kind of peeking out like we mentioned. But it actually is an internal bone that sits inside of the skull like that, okay? All right. So let's continue going through our bones. So those were all of the cranial bones. So now let's talk about here, and I'll label these really quick so we have those words written down. All right, so this will be ethmoid. All right, and then we'll label here for sphenoid. Okay, so let's do our facial bones now. Okay, and I'll put these in a different color. So our facial bones, we're going to see most of those kind of anteriorly, right? They make up the face. That's why they're called the facial bones. Okay, so our first facial bone is going to be the jawbone here. Okay, so this is called the mandible. All right, so the mandible, the jawbone, has sockets for your teeth. Okay, and it's free moving. It actually articulates with the rest of the skull by a synovial joint, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Okay, so that is the mandible. And then we have the other bones. It's actually two bones that have sockets for the teeth. Here in purple, you have a left and a right. These are the maxilla. Okay, so there's two of those. So you have a left and a right maxilla. So this would be a separate one here. Okay, and they kind of meet in the middle. All right, so they also have sockets for teeth. And then the maxilla, if we kind of keep moving past that here, all right, this bone is the zygomatic bone. The zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. All right, so this is zygomatic. All right, you have two of those, so left and a right. So you have your two zygomatic bones. Okay, and then we have our bones that make up kind of the bridge of the nose. So here, these are the nasal bones. Okay, there's two of those, left and a right nasal bones. They're very small and narrow, right? So this would be one here, and this would be the second one here. So you have those two nasal bones, okay? And so then kind of inside of that nasal cavity, that opening that we can see on this picture, we have a couple of important facial bones. So the first one is this little sliver of blue that you can see here. That is called the vomer. And so the vomer, it starts at the front here in the nasal cavity, and it kind of extends back, straight backwards, and gets a little bigger. So we're only seeing a little piece of it here. All right, but this is the vomer. It makes up the bottom part of that nasal septum. Okay, and then the top part you can actually see. So this is the vomer here on the bottom. The top part is made up from the ethmoid bone. All right, so you have the ethmoid meets with the vomer here to form that middle kind of midline of your nasal cavity. Okay, so that's the vomer. All right, and then we also have these green structures that are kind of like downward little shelves, little ridges, right? They kind of sit like that on the inside of the nasal cavity. Those are called, I'm going to write it down here because I need more room. The inferior nasal conchae. All right, and so the nasal conchae are going to be those ridges, right, on the inside of the nasal cavity. And so you'll learn next semester when you go through the respiratory system, the function and the importance of these structures is to help move the air. So when you inhale, this is going to cause turbulence in the air. So then the air can circulate through that nasal cavity, come into contact with a lot of the mucus tissue that's in that nasal cavity, which helps to clean dust and stuff out of the air. So that's the function of these nasal conchae. So you have two inferior nasal conchae bones here and here. Those are separate bones. And then you have a middle, which you can't really see, right? Well, you see here, middle and superior, which is kind of tucked up a little higher, nasal conchae, that are coming from this ethmoid bone. Okay, so altogether you have 6 nasal conchae. 2 come from these inferior nasal conchae bones, and then the other 4 from the ethmoid bone. Okay. All right. So that's kind of inside the nasal cavity. Let's see. So we've done that. All right. So then we just have 2 more sets of bones. So I'm going to go to this picture way off to the right here. All right. For our next pair. and that is going to be here. So we have a left and a right lacrimal bones. All right, so lacrimal bones are located where your lacrimal glands and your lacrimal ducts, right? These are the tear glands in your eyes, and the ducts that bring the tears from your eyes down to your throat, right, travel through this bone. So that's kind of how I remember the name. So lacrimal are your tear glands, and so they're located kind of right at the corner of your eye sockets. All right, so there's two of those. Okay, and then lastly, and I really want to point this out because it's important to understand what we're looking at, is the palatine bones. All right, there's two of those. So the palatine bones make up the posterior, the very back part of your hard palate. Okay, so it's going to be this bone here and here. Okay, so those are the palatine bones. The front part of your hard palate here is made up from the maxilla. Okay, so you have the left and the right maxilla that make up the anterior part of your hard palate, and the palatine bones that make up the posterior part of your hard palate. Okay, and that can be confusing sometimes in lab because the name given to this part of the maxilla that makes up the hard palate is called the palatine process. All right, so you have the palatine process of the maxilla makes up the front part of your hard palate, and the actual palatine bone makes up the back part. Okay. All right. So that is all of our facial bones. Okay. So I want to take a second now to talk about the sinuses. All right. Since we talked about our different cranial and facial bones, let's talk about the sinuses that are associated with them. So first of all, what is a sinus? All right. So a sinus is simply a space, kind of a cavity in a bone, and they're typically filled with air. Sometimes they're lined with mucus tissues that can produce mucus. All right, and so we call those sinuses. So a space in a bone is a sinus. All right, so these are spaces in bone. Okay, and so there's 4 paranasal sinuses that you need to know, and they're just named based on the bones that they're located in. Okay, and so the first one is going to be the frontal sinus. That's going to be in the frontal bone. All right, so there it's in purple here. Okay, so it's just on your forehead. So a lot of these you can think about, when I get a headache, where am I feeling that headache? And that likely would be some sort of inflammation of the tissue in that specific sinus. So if you ever like right on the middle of your forehead get kind of like a sinus headache there, that is going to be from mucus being produced in that frontal sinus. All right, if you ever get like pains kind of on your cheeks, that would be these sinuses here in red. All right, so these are going to be the maxillary sinuses. All right, I'll put that over here. So maxillary there. Okay, and then we have the ethmoid sinus. So if you ever get a headache kind of that feels like it's right behind the bridge of your nose, that would be your ethmoid sinus. All right, here. And then you also have behind that, here in orange, your sphenoid sinus. Okay, and so typically, I'm missing a lot of letters in that one. Let's try that again. There we go. Typically, you don't get inflammation of the sphenoid sinus all that much, okay? But it sits behind that ethmoid sinus. So those are the 4. So frontal, maxillary, ethmoid, and sphenoid sinuses. All right. So last thing on this video I want to touch on is just to briefly go over the vertebral column. So we've done our skull, right? The different bones of the skull, where they're located, the sinuses. So now we're going to move down and start talking about the vertebral column. So I want to talk about the vertebral column in general and the structure of intervertebral discs, and then we'll pick up on more about the vertebrae in the next video. Okay, so with the vertebral column, all right, we divide the vertebral column into three major sections. Okay, so we have our thoracic, or sorry, we'll start with cervical because it comes first. All right, so we have our cervical part of the vertebrae. All right, this is going to contain cervical vertebrae. All right, it contains 7 cervical vertebrae. All right, so there's 7 cervical, and then we move down to thoracic. All right, that's in kind of this green region. So these are thoracic vertebrae. All right, there's going to be 12 thoracic vertebrae, and so the thoracic vertebrae are important because that is where your ribs attach. Okay, so posteriorly, your ribs attach to your thoracic vertebrae. So there's 12 pairs of ribs, 12 vertebrae, and so each thoracic vertebrae has a pair of ribs attached to it. All right, and then we have our lumbar part of the vertebral column. Okay, and so with lumbar, there are 5 lumbar vertebrae. All right, and so one way to remember, and you should know how many vertebrae of each. All right, so there's 7, 12, and 5. I just remember you eat breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and dinner at 5. Okay, and that's one way to remember cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. Okay, so the lumbar vertebrae, all right, and so typically the way you refer to vertebrae is you would say, you know, the first cervical vertebrae would be C1, all right, so you would say C1 through C7. That's how you would refer to them. So the very first cervical vertebrae is C1, and then the last is C7. So then the connection between the cervical and the thoracic would be that you would say, all right, C7 articulates with T1, okay? So that's how you would refer to that. All right, and so if we look down here with our lumbar, all right, so L5, our last lumbar vertebrae, all right, so here, L5 is going to articulate with this kind of curved bone here. This is the sacrum, okay? All right, and so let's label it sacrum. All right, so the sacrum articulates with the last lumbar vertebrae, all right, L5. So it articulates inferiorly, all right, or the inferior surface of L5 articulates with the sacrum. I could ask you a question like that on the exam. Okay, so what bone does the inferior surface of L5 articulate with? All right, and you should be able to tell me. And then the very last part of our vertebral column is going to be the tailbone, okay? And so the tailbone is just this little tiny part here at the bottom, okay? And that is called the coccyx. All right, so we have our coccyx there. Okay, so that's the vertebral column. We're going to probably refer back to this picture in the next video too, and fill in a few more things. Okay, but let's just really quick talk about our intervertebral discs. So how those vertebrae are connected to each other. And so between each vertebrae, you have an intervertebral disc. All right, so that's what we're looking at here. And so you should remember from our tissues chapter what type of tissue is found in that intervertebral disc. All right, and so that is going to be fibrocartilage. All right, so it actually is in the form of a ring. So you have a ring of fibrocartilage here that is called the annulus fibrosus. Annulus fibrosus. Okay, so this is a fibrocartilage ring. All right, and in the middle we have this kind of like gel pad. All right, so the middle of it has a gel pad called the nucleus pulposus. So that's in the middle here. I'll just write it in the middle. All right, so this is the nucleus pulposus. Okay, and so that's kind of like a, we'll just put in here, it's like a gel-like substance. All right, so you have this outer ring of fibrocartilage surrounding that gel-like nucleus pulposus. Okay, and so this nucleus pulposus can kind of throughout the day even, and especially with age as you get older, right, it actually can become more hydrated. So typically in the morning, there's more water in that nucleus pulposus, and throughout the day, all right, it loses a little bit of water. So if you check your height in the morning, you'll actually be slightly taller than you are at night because you're losing a little height from losing that water. And then as you get older, typically elderly people are a little shorter than they were in their youth, and that's because of the kind of breakdown of these discs and that gel. All right, and so your notes ask about a disc when it herniates, what is happening, and that's why I like this picture, because it's actually showing you what's going on. And so when a disc herniates, right, you get kind of a bulge in that annulus fibrosus, okay, and it bulges, all right, and it can become very painful, all right, and it can cause a lot of problems when that bulge actually pushes on what we're seeing here. This is a spinal nerve, and so it's pushing on this nerve that's coming out of the spinal cord. So this would be the spinal cord here, sends out nerves, they go out to the body, all right, and so that bulge, that herniated disc, can press on that spinal nerve, and it can cause numbness, it can cause a lot of pain, just depending on where it's located and what it's pushing on. So you would need surgery to repair that. Okay, all right, so we're going to stop there, and then we're going to talk more about the vertebral column starting in the next video, and then we'll move on and talk about the ribs, and then the appendicular skeleton.